good morning, Starshine. The Earth says hello. It's your boy, Mr. Northrup, and I'm so delighted you've either made the choice to watch another one of my episodes, or you're just literally sitting in front of me in my own classroom, watching this against your will. Whichever one it is, welcome back. If you were with me for our last episode, you know that the 1920s, nicknamed the Roaring Twenties, were a time of sweeping political, social, and economic changes across the US. Now, in fact, there were a ton of things going on in the first few decades of the 1900s. Let's take a look at just a few of them. Now, while these are all important events of the early part of the century, we're going to focus our attention on the ones that led us astray as we entered the Dirty 30s and the Great Depression. But enough bumping gums, all you cats and alligators. Grab yourself a glass of city juice, sit on down next to your best dame, and be ready to blow your wig. This episode's gonna be aces, you hear? Heavens to Betsy, I'd even put a 5-spot on it. What do you say? In the early part of the 1920s, following a push to boost the post-war economy, consumer spending had reached an all-time high. American companies were mass-producing goods, and like good little pawns, consumers were buying. Because technology was steadily improving, consumers had the opportunity to purchase items that would make their lives easier and more luxurious, such as radios, refrigerators, and washing machines. Now, how were people suddenly able to make such purchases? Now, easy, they stole it. Every person living in 1920s America was a dirty thief.
You'll never take me alive!
Of course, I'm kidding. They used installment plans. If someone, let's say a teacher like myself, needed a fresh set of wheels back then, a new car would go for around $500, which translates to about $6,500 today. Now, that seems like a pretty sweet deal until you realize that the average teacher brought home around $1,200 a year and still needed to buy essentials like food and clothes. The credit purchases made it possible to snag that whip and pay it off little by little rather than all at once. Apply that same concept to other items such as electric razors and televisions, and soon those consumers are living beyond their means and the first domino falls. Also booming was the stock market. Since production was up and companies appeared to be making money, stock values in those companies increased. Mr. Northrup, that sounds an awful lot like an economics lesson. That's right, random nondescript student with great hair. To better understand trends throughout US history, you have to know basic economics. Let's go together. A stock is a piece of ownership in a company. When you buy stock in a company, you are betting that the company will make money and that the stock, which represents your piece of that company, will go up in value. You can either keep playing the game and hope to watch it soar, or sell your stock for more money than you had originally paid.
And sometimes they're really high. Sometimes they're very high, the stocks. And you go very high. That's when you
high.
want. That's when you want to sell, when they're very high. You buy them when they're down very low.
It really is a simple concept. And for many who were introduced to it in the 1920s, it was magic money. It was like handing someone $1 and getting $2 in return. What could go wrong? I mean, all the cool rich people were doing it. But the biggest problem facing these new investors was that they did not have a lot of spare money to invest. Now, the way to buy stock without having a lot of money invested up front was to buy on margin. A margin meant you could pay a small amount in cash and borrow the rest from a trading company known as a brokerage firm that would handle all future transactions. Traders would open an account, put a little money in, and the brokerage would return the favor. However, the money they put in was a loan and they expected to be paid back with interest. If the individual had a steady job and a few assets, they could potentially get a loan of up to 90% of the stock value. But anyone who has seen the Netflix series Squid Game knows that when it comes to gambling other people's money, things can get a little dicey. And it wasn't just investors who were borrowing money. The brokerages were borrowing too. All of these IOUs circulating throughout the economy were destined to cause a problem. So as is the case for most stocks, vultures will notice when growth has halted and they're quick to sell. Now, as this occurs, the floor falls out and there is immediate devaluation. While this is bad on its own, it reaches catastrophic status when you factor in just how much of that original value was artificially inflated with loan money. This is the huge risk taken when dealing in speculation or the assumption that you will be able to sell something later at a profit. So not only had investors lost their own money, they lost brokerage money too, something they would demand be repaid by any means necessary. This could lead to a swift destruction of one's credit and an inability to pay for necessities. Buying on margin can result in high rewards, but comes with massive risk. You know the saying, all good things must come to an end? Well, in the blink of an eye, consumers began losing the desire and the ability to keep up with the Joneses in a dramatic transition, much like the last time I listened to Celine Dion.
It was gone with the wind, but it's all coming back to me. It's all coming back, it's all coming back to me now. There were moments of gold and there were flashes of light. There were things we'd never do again, but then they'd always seem right. There were nights of endless pleasure. It was more than all your lost in love. Baby, 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 when you touch me like this, and when you hold me like that, it was gone with the wind, but it's all coming back to me.
Not surprisingly, this led to factories slowing down their production and, in turn, laying off workers. Investors continued to abandon their stocks and prices plummeted.
Oh no!
Our stock market.
It's broken!
In a panic, the aforementioned brokerage firms started calling for their remaining margin balances to be repaid immediately. By Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, a day that will live in infamy as Black Tuesday, the market collapsed. Billions of dollars were wiped out in a matter of a few days, and the situation had reached disaster status. But a common misconception surrounding this event is that it was the sole reason for the Great Depression. While it sure didn't make things any better for Americans, the stock market crash was only one of the reasons the 1930s were so tragic. To get a better idea of just what types of careless acts led us down this road, we needn't go any further than America's parlous peninsula. That's right, baby, Florida. In the early 1920s, hundreds of thousands of people poured into the Sunshine State to invest their money in real estate. The country's economy was growing so rapidly that another version of speculation created get-rich-quick opportunities involving the acquisition of cheap land that could be resold later at a much higher price. In fact, this was such a sure thing that many investors were buying these lots sight unseen. By 1925, Florida's population skyrocketed from around 900,000 to 1.26 million, and these paper millionaires were creating entire cities, including Coral Gables and Miami Shores. However, it was also around this time that the writing began appearing on the wall that the boom would turn bust. Florida land prices were based solely upon the expectation of finding a customer, not upon the reality of land value. Land prices had reached such a ridiculous level that the new customers fell off, and old customers did their best to sell what they had. Eventually, realtors were forced to close up shop, and the tourist market took a similarly hard hit. The silver lining of this story is that the state learned from these mistakes, and we never saw such a terrible real estate disaster ever again.
That is not correct.
So I think it's safe to say that the Florida land boom and bust served as a precursor to what was to come, and hindsight being 2020 should have given us a chance to right the ship had we been dealing with a government that had any interest in intervention. When Herbert Hoover became president in March of 1929, he continued the laissez-faire economic policies of his 1920s predecessors. His belief was that a free market economy, even during a time of uncertainty, would fix itself through the forces of capitalism. He was so sure of this that he dropped the top income tax rate from 25 to 24% as one of his first acts as president. And by September of the same year, the stock market closed at an all-time high, and rich snobs across the country would light a cigar and sip on a glass of brandy to celebrate. But just like the New York Giants after 2011, it was all downhill from there. The banks were able to prolong the inevitable in the days leading up to Black Tuesday by purchasing a ton of dumped stocks, but there was only so much they could do before panic would set in. By November, the market bottomed out and banks began dropping like flies. There were more than 650 bank failures in 1929 alone, and as banks failed, it reduced the money supply because it limited available credit. That meant each dollar was worth more. As the value of the dollar rose, prices fell, which reduced revenue for businesses, creating a ripple effect of personal and business bankruptcies.
I don't understand the words you just said.
The following June, President Hoover attempted the tired strategy of increasing tariffs on certain imports to, at the very least, help farmers. However, if you've been following along with any of these videos, you know this won't end well. Obviously, trading partners retaliated, and the predictable trade war led to an international trade collapse. This was all happening as a large area in the Midwest, including Kansas, Colorado, Oklahoma, Texas, and New Mexico, was suffering from such a terrible drought that abused topsoil turned to dust, and farmers were no longer able to grow crops in the desert-like conditions. The dust made it hard for people to breathe and piled up to the point where houses were buried. Some dust storms were so big that they carried dust all the way to the East Coast. Since crops would not grow and livestock were often choked to death by the dust, many of the farmers and their families migrated to areas like California, where they might have better luck at finding a job. These poor farmers were given the nickname Okies, since so many of them were from the state of Oklahoma, but the name stuck as a way to identify any person from the Dust Bowl looking for work. At first, Hoover asked the American Red Cross to help, but as the crisis worsened, Congress appropriated $65 million for farmer relief. Now, circling back, as bank failures grew, depositors rushed to banks to pull out their savings. The problem was that banks held only 10% of all deposits while lending out the rest. Now, I'm an historian, not a mathematician, but even I know those numbers don't add up. The bank runs quickly put these financial institutions out of business, and more questionable decisions from the Hoover administration continued to shrink the economy and raise the unemployment rate. By the time the 1932 election rolled around, Americans were tired of waiting around for help, and they took matters into their own hands. Feeling as if they had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, voters chose Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who stated, "I pledge you, I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people." His landslide victory was a response from a country that was ready to try something new, and by March, he had launched his New Deal with the Emergency Banking Act, tasked with rehabilitating banks, and the Beer Wine Revenue Act that ended prohibition and taxed alcohol sales to raise revenue. It was clear that Roosevelt was ready to open up the government checkbook and just start signing his name. The New Deal was made up of 3 categories: relief, recovery, and reform. Some of the programs and legislation included the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, the Glass-Steagall Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and the Civil Works Administration. But farmers still weren't out of the woods yet with the handling of the Midwestern dust storms, so there was an emphasis on regulating farm output as well. During the Great Depression, many people were homeless. Sometimes the homeless people grouped together in makeshift shanty towns where they built small shacks out of anything they could find, including cardboard, wood scraps, and crates. These shanty towns often sprung up near soup kitchens or cities where people could get free meals. They were named Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover because many people blamed him for the state of the nation. Once newspapers began using the name to describe these shanty towns, it stuck. Hoovervilles throughout the U.S. varied in size from a few hundred people to thousands, with some of the largest in New York City, Seattle, and St. Louis. The Hooverville in St. Louis was so big that it had its own churches and an unofficial mayor. Another stain on the Hoover administration involved a group of World War I veterans who marched to Washington, D.C. in an effort to get the bonus pay that they were promised in the Bonus Act of 1924. Technically, this bonus wasn't slated for payout until 1945, but with the Depression in full swing, these veterans wanted their money and they wanted it now. The veterans organized a march on Washington to demand the early payment of their bonus pay. Around 15,000 veterans from all over the country converged on the Capitol and set up camp with huts built out of cardboard, scrap wood, and tar paper, much like the ones seen in Hoovervilles. Only veterans and their families were allowed in the camp, and none of them caused any trouble. They just planned to stay until they got their pay. But when that didn't happen, Hoover called in the army for fear they might riot. As the army marched toward the camp, the veterans cheered them on. They thought this army was marching to honor them. They were wrong. The army entered the camp and began to destroy the huts. They used tear gas and bayonets to get the veterans to move. Several veterans, including their wives and children, were injured in the clash. Now, I'm not choosing a side here because both administrations had their flaws, but there was a stark contrast between Hoover and Roosevelt. Part of FDR's appeal was his ability to connect with average Americans, and this was never more apparent than when he was broadcasting his fireside chats over the radio. These were a means of direct communication about the sweeping changes of the New Deal with citizens. The mood of the nation was sour, and FDR knew that he had to inspire confidence and hope in Americans. FDR gave 30 evening radio addresses between 1933 and 1944. While Roosevelt had his supporters, there were plenty of critics of his New Deal tactics who feared the government was too involved in people's lives and that this new emphasis on collectivism was akin to socialism. The debate over these issues continues today. And just like that, we have come to the end of another riveting history lesson, what the teacher students have described as the guy on my schedule. So, what do you do? We had an opportunity to see the case for how the New Deal may have led the country from the depths of the Great Depression, but our next discussion will include some arguments that it was another global conflict that somehow knocked us back on track. World War II will be the centerpiece of our next episode. I'll see you there.